They say silence heals, but Holt Brennan knew better. Silence only made room for the things you were running from. The truck's engine hummed steady as the highway unwound through northern Idaho, each mile stripping away another layer of the world he was leaving behind. Pine trees rose like cathedral walls on both sides of the road, their branches heavy with late autumn snow. The sky hung low and gray, pregnant with the promise of more to come. Holt's hands rested at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, posture upright even after 6 hours of driving. Old habits, the kind that didn't fade just because you traded the uniform for civilian clothes. His olive field jacket was worn soft at the elbows, the fabric faded from years of washing. Beneath it, a flannel shirt in muted red and navy blue checked pattern showed at the collar. The sleeves were rolled to his forearms, revealing hands that bore small scars, pale lines against weathered skin that spoke of work done in difficult places. He was 43 years old, though the gray at his temples made him look older in certain light. His hair was cut in an undercut style, dark brown on top with silver threading through at the sides. A short beard covered his jaw, more gray than brown, now neatly trimmed but not styled. His eyes were the color of winter sky gray-blue, steady, the kind that had learned to see without flinching. In the passenger seat, Ranger sat with military stillness. The German Shepherd was 7 years old, 72 pounds of disciplined muscle and bone. His coat carried the classic saddle pattern, black across the back and shoulders fading to tan and gold along his chest and legs. His ears stood erect, swiveling occasionally to track sounds Holt couldn't hear. The tactical harness across his chest was black nylon with a sturdy handle at the shoulders designed for work, not comfort. Ranger's amber eyes tracked the road ahead with the same focus Holt had seen in men who'd served too long in places where relaxation meant death. The radio crackled with static, then resolved into a voice. Pinewood Ridge continues to see economic revival as development projects move forward. Mayor Henderson credits new partnerships with bringing jobs and investment to the region after years of decline. Holt's jaw tightened slightly. He reached forward and turned the volume down but didn't shut it off completely. Information mattered even when you didn't like what it said. The GPS showed another 40 minutes to the property. 30 acres of forest land, purchased sight unseen with the last of his savings. The listing had been sparse, remote cabin, limited utilities, adjacent to national forest. No neighbors within 3 miles. The kind of place where you could hear yourself think, or hear the things you'd been trying not to think about. A sound cut through the cabin, the distant thump of rotor blades. Holt's hands went white on the steering wheel. His breath caught for half a second before training took over. Exhale. Count. Ground yourself. The helicopter was a medical transport, red and white, passing overhead at a safe altitude. Civilian. Harmless. But for that half second, Holt had been somewhere else. Somewhere hot and dusty where the sound of rotors meant extraction or hell, and you never knew which until the doors opened. Helmand Province, 2012. The mission that ended with 2 body bags and a discharge recommendation that Holt hadn't fought because fighting meant staying, and staying meant facing what he'd done. Ranger shifted in his seat, head turning toward Holt. Not anxious, just aware. "I'm good," Holt said quietly. The dog's ears flicked once, then returned to scanning the road. They drove in silence for another 20 minutes before the highway narrowed to a 2-lane county road, then to a gravel track that disappeared into deep forest. A weathered sign marked the turnoff, private property, no trespassing beyond this point. The truck bounced over ruts frozen hard by early winter cold. Branches scraped the sides, and once a deer bolted across the path so close that Ranger's head snapped toward the movement, but he didn't bark, didn't whine, just tracked it with his eye until it vanished into the trees. Then the forest opened. The cabin sat in a clearing perhaps an acre wide, surrounded on all sides by towering pines. It was smaller than the listing photos had suggested, a single-story structure with weathered wood siding that had faded to the color of ash. The metal roof showed rust at the seams but appeared intact. A narrow porch wrapped around the front, the boards sagging slightly in the middle. Behind the cabin, barely visible through the trees, stood the remnants of an old fire lookout tower. Metal framework rising 30 feet into the canopy access ladder, thick with ice. Holt cut the engine. The silence that followed was absolute. No traffic hum, no distant sirens, no voices bleeding through apartment walls. Just wind moving through pine needles and the faint creak of tree trunks settling under their burden of snow. Ranger's ears rotated forward, processing the acoustic landscape with the methodical efficiency of a working dog cataloging his new territory. Holt opened the driver's door. Cold air rushed in sharp and clean, carrying the scent of pine resin and frozen earth. He stepped out, boots crunching on frost-stiffened ground, and stood for a long moment just breathing. Ranger dropped from the passenger seat with a soft thud, landing in a controlled crouch before straightening. He didn't run, didn't explore. He stood beside Holt and waited for direction. "Scout," Holt said. The shepherd moved forward in a wide arc, nose low, reading scent trails invisible to human eyes. His movements were economical, no wasted energy, no excitement. This was reconnaissance, not play. Holt walked to the cabin door. The lock was old but functional. The key from the realtor turned with some resistance, and the door swung inward on hinges that groaned from disuse. Inside, the air was stale and cold. Dust covered every surface in an even layer, undisturbed. One main room dominated the space, a cast-iron stove in the corner, a small kitchenette along one wall, a narrow staircase leading to what must be a sleeping loft above. The windows were intact but streaked with years of weather. Afternoon light filtered through in pale shafts, illuminating particles of dust floating lazily in the still air. It wasn't much, but it was quiet. Holt set his duffel bag on the floor and began a methodical inspection. He checked window latches, tested floorboards for soft spots, opened the stove to inspect the flue. Everything showed age and neglect, but nothing appeared structurally unsound. The cabin had been waiting patient as the forest around it. Ranger entered behind him, pausing at the threshold to scan the interior before stepping inside. He moved room to room, the click of his nails on bare wood marking his progress. By the time the sun began its early winter descent, Holt had unloaded the truck and started a fire in the stove. The first wisps of smoke rose straight up in the still air, then caught wind above the tree line and dispersed. The cabin's interior utilities were limited, and the loft needed repairs before it would be safe to use. Rather than risk it, Holt had erected a small tent just outside the cabin's front door, a temporary measure until he could make proper repairs. He worked methodically, driving stakes into half-frozen ground, threading poles through fabric loops. The tent went up at a slight angle, one corner sagging where a support pole didn't quite seat properly. Holt stepped back to assess his work. Ranger sat 10 feet away, head tilted at a precise 15-degree angle. The dog's expression was neutral, professional. But something in the set of his ears and the slow, deliberate blink of his amber eyes communicated a very clear assessment. Holt looked at the tent, then at Ranger. "Not a word, Doyum." "No word," Holt said. Ranger's eyes tracked from the sagging corner to Holt's face, then back to the tent. Another slow blink. Despite himself, Holt felt the corner of his mouth twitch, almost a smile. Almost. "It's functional," he said. The dog stood turned with military precision and walked back toward the cabin without looking at the tent again. Holt shook his head and returned to his work. As darkness settled over the clearing, Holt made his way into town. The drive took 20 minutes on winding forest roads that finally opened onto a main street that looked like it had been frozen in time somewhere around 1985. Pinewood Ridge was small, one stoplight, a handful of businesses clustered around a central square, a hardware store with faded paint, a library that shared space with the post office, and at the far end a diner with a neon sign that read Margie's in cursive script that had lost 2 letters to weather and neglect. Holt parked the truck and sat for a moment watching people move past the windows inside. Small town faces. The kind of place where strangers got noticed. "Hold position," he told Ranger. The dog settled into place without argument, gaze fixed forward through the windshield. Inside, the diner smelled of coffee and grease and something baking that might have been pie. A scattering of customers occupied booths and counter stools. Locals, from the way they spoke to each other, with the easy familiarity of people who'd lived in proximity for decades. Conversations paused when Holt entered. Eyes tracked him from door to counter, not hostile, just measuring. He took a stool at the far end away from the clusters of conversation. A waitress appeared within seconds, early 60s, gray hair pulled back in a practical bun name tag reading Dot. "Coffee?" she asked. "Please." She poured without further comment, then slid a laminated menu across the counter. "Kitchen's open for another hour." Holt scanned the options. Everything was either fried or came with gravy. He ordered eggs and toast. The door opened again, bringing with it a gust of cold air and a man in uniform. Deputy Ford Merrick was 48 years old, with the kind of build that suggested he'd been athletic once but had let it soften around the middle. His hair was dark brown, graying at the temples, cut short and neat, clean-shaven. His uniform was pressed badge polished to a mirror shine. He moved with the careful posture of a man conscious of being watched. His eyes found Holt immediately. Merrick approached with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "New in town." "Just arrived," Holt said. "Ford Merrick, deputy." He didn't offer his hand, but his tone was cordial. Don't get many new faces this time of year. Holt Brennan bought some property east of here. Something flickered across Merrick's face, recognition maybe, or calculation. The old Hutchins place, 30 acres cabin and some forest land. That's right, remote out there. You planning to stay through winter? Planning to stay, Holt said simply. Merrick nodded slowly. Well, welcome to Pinewood Ridge. Just so you're aware, the eastern boundary of your property backs up to restricted Forest Service land. Hunting's prohibited in that zone, and there are some areas marked off limits due to old industrial sites. Best to keep to your own acreage. The words were friendly enough, but they carried weight, a polite warning wrapped in neighborly advice. Understood, Holt said. Merrick's smile widened fractionally. Good. Folks around here appreciate people who respect boundaries. He touched the brim of his hat in a casual salute. Enjoy your meal. The deputy collected a to-go order from Dot and left the door chiming softly behind him. Holt's eggs arrived, and he ate in silence, aware of the occasional glances from other customers. When he finished, he left cash on the counter and headed for the door. You got a dog in that truck, Dot called after him. Holt paused. I do. She disappeared into the kitchen and returned with a paper-wrapped package. Hot dog, on the house, for the dog. Appreciate it, Holt said, taking the package. Outside, he unwrapped the hot dog and held it out to Ranger through the window. The shepherd leaned forward, nostrils flaring, as he processed scent molecules. His nose moved over the surface of the meat with scientific precision. Then he pulled back and turned his head to the side and stared pointedly out the opposite window. Holt looked at the hot dog, then at Ranger. Seriously, Ranger's ears rotated backwards slightly, not in fear or submission, but in what could only be described as polite rejection. It's food, Holt said. The dog's gaze remained fixed on the middle distance, as if the hot dog had ceased to exist entirely. Holt wrapped it back up and set it on the dashboard. Your standards are going to make this harder than it needs to be. Ranger's tail thumped once against the seat, a small, economical movement that somehow conveyed satisfaction. The drive back to the cabin was quiet. Night had settled fully over the forest, and the headlights carved a narrow tunnel through darkness that seemed absolute. No streetlights, no house lights, just trees and stars and the occasional reflection of eyes in the underbrush deer or coyote watching the truck pass. When they arrived back at the clearing, Holt cut the engine and sat for a moment listening to the silence settle around them. Ranger's ears swiveled, suddenly locking onto something in the darkness beyond the cabin. Holt followed his gaze, but saw nothing. What is it? The dog remained perfectly still, focused on something invisible in the eastern tree line. Holt grabbed his flashlight and stepped out. The beam swept across the clearing, illuminating frost-covered grass and the dark wall of pines beyond. Nothing moved. No sound except wind. But Ranger didn't relax. Show me, Holt said. The shepherd moved forward with purpose, leading Holt across the clearing toward the trees. At the edge, where forest shadow deepened into complete darkness, Ranger stopped. Holt knelt, playing the flashlight beam across the ground. Boot prints. Fresh ones. The tread pattern was clear in a patch of frost, heavy-soled work boots, size 11 or 12. The prints came from deeper in the forest, approached to within 30 feet of the cabin, then circled back the way they'd come. Holt's pulse remained steady, but his awareness sharpened. Someone had been here, recently, while they were in town. He followed the tracks with the flashlight beam until they disappeared into the trees. No other signs, no tire tracks at the access road. Whoever it was had come on foot. Ranger stood at his shoulder, alert but not aggressive, cataloging threat level without panic. Good work, Holt said quietly. They returned to the cabin. Holt added more wood to the stove and checked the locks on the door and windows. Not paranoia, just prudent awareness. The same kind of attention that kept you alive in places where the line between safe and dangerous shifted without warning. He unrolled his sleeping bag on the floor near the stove where heat gathered. Ranger circled twice and settled nearby, chin resting on his paws, eyes half closed but ears still tracking every sound. Holt lay back and stared at the ceiling where firelight cast shifting shadows. His body was tired from travel, but his mind moved through the day's data points. The deputies warning, the boot prints, the way Merrick's expression had changed when Holt mentioned his property location. Pieces of something, not yet a pattern but not random either. Outside wind moved through the pines with a sound like distant water. An owl called from somewhere close, then fell silent. Holt's eyes closed, but sleep came slowly, interrupted by fragments of memory that surfaced like debris from deep water. Desert heat, rotor washed the face of a man he'd failed to save. Corporal Marcus Chen, 24 years old. Dead because Holt had trusted flawed intelligence instead of his own instincts. He pushed the memories down and focused on his breathing. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. Eventually sleep came. Morning arrived with pale light that turned the frost-covered clearing into a field of diamonds. Holt woke to silence and cold air on his face where it emerged from the sleeping bag. The fire had burned down to embers. Ranger was already awake, sitting near the door with the patient stillness of a dog who'd been waiting for permission to move. "Go ahead," Holt said. The shepherd nosed the door open. Holt had left it unlatched and stepped outside. Holt dressed quickly in the cold, pulling on thermal layers beneath his flannel shirt, then the field jacket. His breath plumed white in the cabin's interior. He rekindled the fire, filled a pot with water from the hand pump, and set it on the stove to heat. Outside, Ranger was making a methodical circuit of the clearing nose down, processing overnight scent trails. Holt stepped onto the porch with a mug of instant coffee and surveyed his new territory in daylight. 30 acres. Most of it dense forest, but the clearing provided good visibility in all directions. The cabin was positioned with its back to the north facing south to catch maximum daylight. Good placement. Whoever built it had understood winter. Beyond the cabin, deeper into the forest to the east, something caught his eye, a break in the tree pattern, a gap where the pines thinned slightly. He walked toward it, boots crunching through frost-stiffened grass. Ranger intercepted him halfway across the clearing, moving with sudden purpose. The dog positioned himself directly in Holt's path and sat. "What?" Holt asked. Ranger's gaze was locked on the eastern tree line, not the casual awareness from last night. This was focused. Absolute. Holt scanned the trees, saw nothing unusual. "Show me." The shepherd stood and moved forward, but slowly now, each step deliberate. Holt followed, every sense heightened. They pushed through a screen of young pines branches, heavy with snow that dumped powder across Holt's shoulders. The forest floor was thick with needles and deadfall, making footing treacherous. 50 yards in the trees opened slightly. And there it was. A train car. Not a building, not a hunting shack. A full-size diesel freight sitting in the middle of the forest like it had grown there. Holt stopped processing what he was seeing. The car was old paint, faded to ghost traces of red and white rust bleeding through at every seam and rivet. It was oriented north-south, parallel to the slope of the land. There were no tracks beneath it, no road access visible, just forest floor and the massive steel hulk sitting there as if it had fallen from the sky. The side of the car bore a logo barely visible beneath decades of weather, Northern Pacific ERR 1987. Holt circled it slowly, Ranger at his heel. The car was perhaps 40 feet long, windows high and small, now dark with accumulated grime. One of the sliding doors hung partially open, the mechanism rusted into place. He stopped at the opening and peered inside. Darkness, a smell of old metal and decay. "Wait here," he told Ranger. He pulled the door wider, metal screeching in protest, and stepped inside. The interior was dim, lit only by the weak daylight filtering through dirty windows. The floor was littered with debris, leaves, small animal droppings, scraps of fabric rotted beyond recognition. But along one wall, somehow preserved by the shelter of the car itself, sat a metal storage box. Holt knelt beside it. The box was secured with a padlock that had rusted through. He pulled it free and opened the lid. Inside, papers. Maps hand-drawn on graph paper showing topographical details and grid coordinates. Letters and numbers marked specific locations. One area circled multiple times in red ink was labeled Grid 47N, beneath the map's documents. Official letterhead from something called Clearwater Mining Corporation. Disposal permits, transit manifests for industrial waste materials, and photographs. Polaroids, their colors faded but still legible. Men in hard hats standing beside barrels marked with hazard symbols. Trucks dumping loads into open pits. And one photo of a man in his 40s, thin face and tense eyes, holding a protest sign. "Stop the dump, protect our water." At the bottom of the box, wrapped in plastic that had partially degraded, a journal. Holt lifted it carefully. The cover was water-stained but intact. He opened to the first page. The handwriting was small, precise, urgent, property of Thomas Locke, October 1998. If you are reading this, you listen to something, maybe conscience, maybe coincidence. They will tell you, "I died in an accident." I did not. Holt turned pages slowly, reading fragments. Documented burial of PCBs and mercury compounds at Grid 47N. Forged EPA permits. County officials paid to look the other way. This train car was supposed to carry the evidence out. Arranged transport, but they found out. Being followed. October 14th, 1998. Tomorrow is the public hearing. If I don't make it, this journal is the only proof. Finish what I started. The final entry was dated October 15th, 1998. They're outside my house. I'm leaving this in the train car. To whoever finds it, the truth is buried at grid 47N. Don't let them bury it forever. T.L. Holt sat back on his heels, the journal in his hands. Outside, Ranger gave a low warning sound, not a bark, just a rumble in the chest. Holt moved to the door. Through the trees, barely visible from this angle, he could see the cabin in the distance, and beyond it, the access road. A dark pickup truck sat parked where the road ended. Someone was standing beside it, looking toward the forest. Holt remained still watching. The figure was too far away to identify, but the posture suggested calculation rather than casual observation. After perhaps 30 seconds, the person climbed back into the truck and drove away. Holt returned to the metal box and gathered everything: the maps, documents, journal photographs. He wrapped them carefully in his jacket to protect them from moisture and carried them back to the cabin. Ranger led the way, moving with the same careful awareness he'd shown approaching the train car. Inside, Holt spread the materials across the small table and began a systematic review. The story they told was clear enough. Thomas Locke had been an environmental activist who'd discovered illegal toxic waste disposal in the late 90s. He'd gathered evidence, planned to present it at a public hearing, and then he'd died. Holt pulled out his phone, no service this deep in the forest, and made a note to research Locke's death when he could reach a library or internet connection. The rest of the day passed in physical work. Holt cut firewood, reinforced the tent stakes, and began preliminary repairs on the cabin's porch. Ranger patrolled the clearing at irregular intervals, maintaining awareness without stress. As afternoon faded toward evening, Holt decided another trip to town was necessary. He needed supplies, and more importantly, he needed information. The Pinewood Ridge Library shared a building with the post office, a brick structure at the south end of Main Street. Inside, it smelled of old paper and floor wax. A handful of people sat at tables reading newspapers or using one of 3 ancient desktop computers. Holt approached the desk where a woman in her 70s sat surrounded by stacks of books awaiting return to shelves. "Afternoon," he said. "I'm looking for local newspaper archives, specifically late 1998. She studied him over reading glasses. "We keep microfiche going back to 1947. You know how to use a reader." "I'll manage." She led him to a corner where a boxy machine sat on a desk flanked by filing cabinets. "October through December 1998 should be in the 3rd drawer. Let me know if you need help." Holt found the correct drawer and began threading film through the reader. The Pinewood Gazette was a weekly publication, thin as a church bulletin. He advanced through September, then into October. October 18th, 1998. The headline was small, buried on page 3, "Local activist dies in single-car accident." Thomas Locke, 41, died late Thursday night when his vehicle left County Road 7 and struck a tree. Sheriff's deputies said weather conditions were poor, with heavy rain reported in the area. No other vehicles were involved. Locke was pronounced dead at the scene. Locke had been a vocal critic of development projects in the county and was scheduled to speak at Friday's Planning Commission hearing regarding proposed industrial expansion near the Eastern Forest Service boundary. The hearing has been postponed. He is survived by a sister, Margaret Locke of Spokane. Service is pending. Holt read it 3 times. The details were sparse to the point of suspicious. No mention of investigation, no quotes from witnesses. Just a brief report of an accident that had conveniently occurred the night before Locke was supposed to present evidence of corruption. He scrolled forward through subsequent weeks. No follow-up articles, no investigation updates. Thomas Locke simply disappeared from the public record. Holt made notes on key dates and names, then returned the microfiche to its drawer. Outside, dusk was settling. He walked to the truck where Ranger waited and sat for a moment, organizing his thoughts. A tap on the window startled him. A woman stood beside the truck, late 20s, dark brown hair pulled back in a loose ponytail, with copper highlights catching the fading light. She wore a forest green parka over a cream sweater, camera bag slung across one shoulder. Her eyes were deep brown, sharp with intelligence and something else. Determination, maybe. Or anger held carefully in check. Holt rolled down the window. "Help you, Marlo Vale," she said, "freelance journalist. I saw you at the library. You were reading about Thomas Locke." "Just researching local history." "Right." Her smile was thin. "I've been researching local history for 8 months. What's your interest?" Holt studied her. She didn't look away. "Holt Brennan. I own property east of town. Found some things that raise questions." Marlo glanced at Ranger, who sat perfectly still in the passenger seat, amber eyes fixed on her without aggression or welcome. Just observation. Can we talk, she asked. Somewhere not here. Holt considered. Information flowed both ways. Coffee shop still open. Closed at 5. But the ranger station has a visitor area. It's neutral ground. 10 minutes later, they sat in a small room adjacent to the main ranger office. The walls were covered with maps of the National Forest and educational posters about fire safety. Ranger lay near Holt's feet, calm but attentive. Marlowe pulled a folder from her bag and spread papers on the table between them. Thomas Locke wasn't killed in an accident. He was murdered. I can't prove it yet, but I know it. Why? Holt asked. Because my brother died the same way. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly as she organized the papers. Carter Vale, March 2018. Single car crash on County Road 7. Same stretch of road, same weather conditions, same sparse investigation. She showed him a photograph, a young man in his 30s smiling, holding up a fish. Carter was an environmental engineer. He'd been hired to do a groundwater study near the eastern forest boundary. 3 weeks into the project, he called me and said he'd found something wrong. Chemical contamination that shouldn't be there. He was going to report it. Then he died. Holt looked at the papers she'd spread out. Survey maps, water quality reports, county records showing land ownership changes. What did he find? Holt asked. I don't know exactly. His files disappeared. His laptop was never recovered from the car. But I started asking questions, and the more I dug, the more I found. She pointed to a series of documents. Look at this. In 1998, Clearwater Mining Corporation applied for permits to dispose of industrial waste on land adjacent to National Forest. The permits were approved, but there's no record of proper EPA oversight. Then in 2003, the company declared bankruptcy, and the site was supposedly sealed. Grid 47 NM, Holt said. Marlowe's eyes widened. You found his documentation. Some of it. Show me. Holt hesitated, then made a decision. He pulled out his phone where he'd photographed several pages from Thomas Locke's journal. He showed her the images. Marlowe read in silence, her jaw tightening with each page. When she finished, she looked up. This is exactly what Carter was investigating. 20 years later, and it's still there. Before Holt could respond, the door opened. Ranger Boone Carver stood in the doorway, 44 years old, broad-shouldered, with a weathered face that suggested decades of outdoor work. He wore the standard Forest Service uniform, green jacket with patches at the shoulders. His expression was neutral, but his eyes were sharp. Marlowe, he said, didn't expect to see you here this late. His gaze shifted to Holt. Mr. Brennan, we haven't met formally. Boone Carver, District Ranger. Sir, Holt said, standing. Boone waved him back down. At ease. I'm not military anymore, though I recognize the bearing. He looked between them. What's this about? Marlowe didn't hesitate. Holt found Thomas Locke's documentation from 1998, everything Carter was looking for. Boone's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture. He closed the door behind him and sat down. Where? On my property, Holt said. In a train car that shouldn't exist. The old freight at Gon, Boone said. I've seen it on surveys. Always wondered how it got there. He paused. I need to tell you something. I knew Thomas Locke, not well, but I knew him. When he died, I was working county patrol. This was before I transferred to Forest Service. I was one of the deputies who responded to the accident scene. And Marlowe leaned forward, and it never sat right. The weather was bad, yes, but Locke knew those roads. He'd driven them 1,000 times, and his car went off the road on a straight stretch with good visibility. There were no skid marks, no evidence of braking at all. Why didn't you say anything? Marlowe asked. I was 22 years old, 6 months on the Brom. The sheriff ruled it an accident. Who was I to question it? Boone's jaw tightened. But I've thought about it for 26 years. When your brother died, Marlowe, I thought about it even more. You think they're connected, Holt said. I think someone has been protecting something for a very long time. And I think you just became a problem for them by finding Locke's evidence. As if summoned by those words, headlights swept across the windows. A vehicle pulled into the parking lot, a dark SUV with county markings. Deputy Ford Merrick stepped out, straightening his uniform as he approached the building. Boone stood. Let me handle this. He stepped into the main office. Through the open door, they could hear Merrick's voice, cordial and professional. Evening, Boone. Saw Mr. Brennan's truck. Wanted to check in, make sure he's settling in okay. He's fine, just getting oriented. Mind if I say hello? There was a pause. Then Boone's voice, carefully neutral. Sure, come on back. Merrick entered the room, his smile perfectly calibrated. Mr. Brennan, Miss Vale, didn't mean to interrupt. Not interrupting, Holt said. Merrick's eyes took in the paper spread on the table, but he didn't comment directly. Just wanted to follow up on our conversation from the diner. Make sure you're aware of the eastern boundary restrictions. That whole area has some environmental concerns. Old industrial sites, not safe for exploration. Appreciate the warning, Holt said. Good. Merrick's gaze lingered on Marlowe. Ms. Vale, I heard you were asking questions at the county recorder's office again. Just want to remind you that some of those old records are protected under privacy statutes. Public land records are public, Marlowe said evenly. True, just making sure you're not inadvertently crossing any lines. His smile never wavered. Well, I'll let you folks get back to it. Mr. Brennan, you know where to find me if you need anything. He left. Through the window, they watched his SUV pull away. He knows, Marlowe said quietly. Of course he knows, Boone replied. Question is, how deep is he in it? Holt gathered the papers from the table. I need to get back. Can we meet tomorrow? My place, Boone said. 7 a.m. I'll make coffee. Outside, full dark had fallen. Holt and Ranger walked to the truck, and Holt felt the weight of being watched. Not immediate threat, just awareness. Someone tracking movement. The drive back to the cabin was tense. Headlights appeared in the rearview mirror about halfway distant, but following. They stayed back, never closing, never turning off. When Holt reached the access road to his property, the lights continued past. He parked near the cabin and sat for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to darkness. Ranger's head was up, ears forward, focused on the tree line. Holt grabbed his flashlight and stepped out. The clearing was empty, silent, but something felt wrong. He approached the cabin slowly, Ranger at his side. Everything appeared undisturbed. Door still locked, windows intact. Then he saw them. Boot prints in the frost. Different from the ones he'd found the first night, these were smaller, more deliberate. They circled the cabin in a complete loop, then headed into the forest toward the east, toward the train car. Holt followed the tracks with his flashlight beam to the tree line, then stopped. Going into the forest at night without backup was tactically unsound. Instead, he returned to the cabin, secured the interior, and positioned himself near the window with a clear view of the clearing. Ranger settled beside him, alert but not anxious. They waited. At 11:47 p.m., Holt's phone buzzed. Text message from an unknown number. Leave it alone. This is your only warning. Holt deleted the message and set the phone down. He thought about Thomas Locke dying on a dark road the night before he could tell the truth. About Carter Vale meeting the same fate 20 years later. About the people who'd stayed silent and the people who'd profited. He looked down at Ranger, who met his gaze with amber eyes that held no fear. Not running, Holt said quietly. The dog's tail moved once. Agreement. Outside the forest held its secrets a while longer. But morning would come, and with it decisions that couldn't be unmade. The silence wasn't healing, not yet, but it was clarifying. And sometimes that was enough. The coffee at Boone Carver's house was strong enough to strip paint, and Holt was grateful for it. He'd slept in 2-hour shifts, waking each time to check the perimeter through frosted windows. No further disturbances, no vehicles. Just the forest settling into deeper cold as the night wore on. Boone's cabin sat 3 miles west of town, tucked into a grove of aspens that had gone skeletal for winter. Inside, the walls were lined with topographical maps and black and white photographs of the forest in different eras. A wood stove radiated heat from the corner. Ranger lay near it, having made his assessment of the space and found it acceptable. Marlowe arrived 10 minutes after Holt, her camera bag over one shoulder and a laptop under her arm. Her eyes carried the same sleepless shadows Holt saw in his own reflection. Show him, she said without preamble, setting the laptop on Boone's kitchen table. Holt laid out the photographs from Thomas Locke's metal box, the images of barrels being buried. Men in hard hats standing over open pits. Document after document showing Clearwater Mining Corporation's waste disposal permits, all signed by county officials, all dated 1997 through early 1998. Boone studied them in silence, his jaw working. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. I was in the Army when this was happening. Intelligence specialist stationed in Germany. Came back in 2002 and took the Forest Service position. He tapped one of the photographs. This is Grid 47N. I know exactly where this is. It's been restricted access since I started. They told me environmental remediation was ongoing. Was it? Holt asked. I've never seen remediation crews. Never seen equipment. Just signs that say restricted, environmental hazard, and a chain link fence that's been there since before I arrived. Marlowe opened her laptop and pulled up a digital file. I've been mapping property records. Look at this. She showed them a series of overlaid maps. This is the county land registry from 1995. This area, she highlighted a section, is marked as Federal Forest Service land. Now look at 2002. The boundaries had shifted, not dramatically, but enough. What had been federal land now showed as private parcels transferred to a shell company called Ridge Development Holdings. Same thing happened all around Grid 47. Marlowe continued. Small adjustments, a few acres here and there. Over time, it created a buffer zone of private property around the waste site. Legally, it made it harder for federal oversight. Who owns Ridge Development? Holt asked. Marlowe's expression darkened. That's where it gets complicated. The company dissolved in 2008. Assets were transferred to another entity, which dissolved in 2015. I've traced it through 4 different shell corporations. The current owner of record is something called Northern Investments LLC, registered in Delaware. Can't trace Delaware corporations, Boone muttered. That's the point of them. Holt studied the maps, his mind cataloging connections. Merrick knew I was looking into this within hours of me finding Locke's documentation. That means someone's watching. Either there's surveillance I haven't found or someone at the library reported you, Marlowe finished. Small town, people talk. Or, Boone said quietly, Merrick's been watching your property since you arrived. You said there were boot prints the first night. Holt nodded. He knew you'd find the train car eventually. You bought land right next to it. That can't be coincidence. The 3 of them sat in silence, the implications settling like sediment. There's something else, Marlowe said. She pulled up another file, a scanned newspaper article from 2011. The headline read, County Approves Development Partnership. The article detailed a collaboration between the county government and a private investment group to revitalize Pinewood Ridge's economy through strategic development initiatives. The photo showed 5 men in suits shaking hands. One of them was labeled as Ford Merrick, described as County Development Liaison. He wasn't just a deputy, Marlowe said. He was part of the development office. Until 2014, when he transferred to law enforcement. Same year, the last person to publicly question the environmental reports died, Boone added. Ellen Marsh, retired EPA inspector. Moved here, started asking questions about why Grid 47N had never been properly remediated. Died of carbon monoxide poisoning in her home. Faulty furnace. Holt felt the familiar weight of pattern recognition settling into place. Not proof, not yet, but structure emerging from chaos. How many deaths are we talking about? Boone pulled out a notebook, actual paper filled with handwritten notes. Thomas Locke, 1998. Ellen Marsh, 2014. Carter Vale, 2018. And if you go back further, there were 2 workers from Clearwater Mining who died in industrial accidents in 1997, right when the disposal operations were happening. 5 deaths, Marlowe whispered, over 30 years. That we know about, Boone said. A knock at the door shattered the moment. Ranger was on his feet, instantly positioned between the door and Holt. Not aggressive, just ready. Boone moved to the window and looked out. His shoulders relaxed fractionally. It's okay, I know him. He opened the door to reveal a man in his late 60s, weathered face beneath a wool cap, wearing coveralls stained with engine grease. Morning, Boone. The man's voice was rough from decades of smoking. His eyes found Holt and Marlowe, assessing them with the quick judgment of someone used to determining friend from threat. Didn't mean to interrupt. You're not. Come in, Ray. This is Holt Brennan and Marlowe Vale. Folks, this is Ray Nash. He runs the only mechanic shop in town. Ray stepped inside, bringing with him the smell of cold air and motor oil. He nodded to Holt and Marlowe, then his attention fixed on Ranger. That's a working dog. He is, Holt confirmed. Ray's expression tightened with something that might have been hope or desperation. Then maybe you can help. My boy's missing. The words landed like a physical blow. What? Boone was already moving toward Ray. Since last night, Gideon, he's 9, told me he was going to his friend's house after school, never showed up. Friend's parents called me around 7. I've been looking all night, called Merrick around midnight. He said he'd organize a search party at dawn, but Ray's voice cracked. It's been 12 hours. Where was he last seen? Holt asked, his training taking over, emotions compartmentalized. School bus dropped him at the corner of Main and Spruce at 3:45. He was supposed to walk 4 blocks to the Henderson place. Never arrived. Marlowe was already pulling up a map on her laptop. Show me the route. Ray traced it with a shaking finger. 4 blocks, residential area. No reason for a 9-year-old boy to vanish in broad daylight. Did Merrick start the search? Boone asked. He said he would, Told me to go home and wait in case Gideon came back. Ray's hands clenched into fists. But I can't just sit there. I know this forest. Gideon knows it too. Sometimes he explores near the eastern boundary, even though I've told him it's restricted. Holt's attention sharpened. The eastern boundary, near Grid 47 North. There's an old trail system back there. Kids use it sometimes, though they're not supposed to. Ray looked at Boone. You know the area. Help me look. Boone grabbed his coat. Of course. Holt stood. Rangers trained in tracking. If you have something with Gideon's scent, his jacket, in my truck. They moved with purpose, born of urgency. Ray's truck was parked outside a faded blue Ford with a cracked windshield. He pulled a small jacket from the passenger seat, bright red size for a child. Holt held it out to Ranger. Track. The shepherd buried his nose in the fabric, inhaling deeply processing scent molecules with the precision of a biological instrument. When he lifted his head, his entire body had shifted into working mode. Ears forward, muscles coiled, every sense focused on a task that transcended comfort or fear. He's got it, Holt said. Where was Gideon last confirmed to be? They drove to the corner where the school bus had dropped him off. Ray pointed to the sidewalk. Right there. Mrs. Peterson saw him getting off the bus, said he waved to her and headed that direction. He indicated west toward the friend's house. Ranger jumped from the truck and immediately went to work, nose sweeping the ground in methodical arcs. He moved along the sidewalk for half a block, then stopped at a gap between two houses. A narrow path led through overgrown yards toward the forest beyond. The dog looked back at Holt, not seeking permission, confirming direction. He went into the woods, Holt said. Ray's face went pale. Jesus, that leads toward the restricted zone. They followed Ranger into the forest. The trail was barely visible, probably used more by deer than humans. Snow had fallen lightly during the night, just enough to hold tracks. Small footprints of child's sneakers appeared intermittently where the snow had accumulated. Ranger moved with controlled urgency, never losing the scent, pausing occasionally to recalibrate when wind patterns shifted. Holt stayed close behind, his awareness expanding to include terrain, weather conditions, potential hazards. Boone and Ray followed the mechanics, breathing harsh with fear and cold. The forest grew denser as they moved east. The trail forked several times, and each time Ranger chose a direction with absolute confidence. They were heading steadily toward the boundary of Holt's property, toward the restricted zone beyond it. After 40 minutes of tracking, they broke through a line of trees into a small clearing. Warning signs had been posted on trees around the perimeter, yellow and black. Restricted area, environmental hazard, no trespassing, County Order 47N. Ranger didn't hesitate. He moved directly toward a gap in the chain-link fence that had been cut and bent back, creating a child-sized opening. Oh, God, Ray whispered. They pushed through the gap. On the other side, the forest had a different quality, thinner vegetation, an odd chemical smell beneath the pine scent, and there, barely visible through the trees, rusted barrels partially buried in earth and deadfall. Grid 47N, Ranger's pace increased. Not panic, purpose. He led them around a cluster of barrels to a depression in the ground where water had pooled and frozen. Gideon Nash lay curled against a fallen log, unconscious, his lips tinged blue with cold. Ray was on his knees beside her son before Holt could move. Gideon, wake up. Holt knelt and checked the boy's pulse, weak but present, breathing shallow. He's hypothermic. We need to warm him slowly. He stripped off his field jacket and wrapped it around the child, then lifted him carefully. The boy was small for 9 thin. He weighed maybe 60 pounds. There's more, Boone said, his voice tight. Holt turned. Boone was examining Gideon's hands. The palms were red and blistered, chemical burns radiating from where he'd touched something. He touched the barrels, Boone said. Whatever's in them is still active. The implications crashed down like an avalanche. The site wasn't sealed. The waste wasn't remediated. It was still here, still toxic, still dangerous. And a 9-year-old boy had almost died proving it. Ray's face had gone from pale to flushed with rage. They said it was safe. The signs say environmental hazard, but the county told us it was sealed in 2003. They've been saying that for 20 years. We need to get him to a hospital, Holt said. Now. They moved as quickly as safety allowed, Holt carrying Gideon, while Ranger led them back along the trail. The boy stirred and, once mumbling something incoherent, then fell still again. Ray called ahead on his cell phone. Service was spotty but functional, this close to town. An ambulance met them at the trailhead. Paramedics took over, loading Gideon onto a stretcher, starting an IV, wrapping him in thermal blankets. Chemical exposure, Holt told the lead paramedic, showing him Gideon's hands. Unknown compounds, but likely industrial waste. PCBs, possibly mercury. The paramedic's eyes widened. We need to notify poison control. This is serious. As the ambulance pulled away, sirens cutting through the morning air, a sheriff's SUV arrived. Deputy Ford Merrick stepped out, his expression carefully arranged into concern. Ray, I just heard. How is he? Ray turned on him with fury. Holt recognized from men who'd been pushed beyond their breaking point. Where the hell were you? I called you 12 hours ago. I organized a search party for Dawn like I said. My son almost died in a sealed site that isn't sealed. Ray's voice cracked. Chemical burns Ford, from barrels that aren't supposed to be there anymore. Merrick's mask slipped for just a fraction of a second. Not guilt, calculation. That's terrible. We'll need to investigate how he got past the fence. The fence was cut, Boone interrupted, and it's been cut for a while. The edges are rusted. This isn't new. Merrick's gaze shifted to Boone, then to Holt. Mr. Brennan, you helped with the search. My dog tracked him. Lucky you were available. The words carried subtext. I'll need statements from all of you, standard procedure. You'll get them, Boone said, after we make sure Gideon's stable. They left Merrick standing in the trailhead parking area and headed for the hospital. The Pinewood Ridge Medical Center was small, 20 beds, basic emergency services. Anything serious got transferred to Coeur d'Alene, but they had a competent staff, and within an hour Gideon was stable, conscious, asking for his father in a small, scared voice that made Holt's chest tight. Ray stayed with him while Boone, Marlowe, and Holt gathered in the waiting room. This changes everything, Marlowe said quietly. A child was injured at a site the county claims is remediated. That's front-page news. That's federal investigation. If we can prove the county knew it wasn't safe, Boone added. If we can connect Merrick to the cover-up. We can, Holt said. He pulled out his phone and showed them photographs he'd taken at Grid 47N while they were waiting for the ambulance. Barrels with visible hazard symbols. Ground contamination. The cut fence. This is evidence. Marlowe's fingers moved across her laptop keyboard. I'm uploading these to an encrypted server. Multiple backups. If anything happens. Nothing's going to happen, a new voice said. They turned. Callum Price stood in the waiting room doorway, dressed in an immaculate gray suit despite the early hour. His expression was pleasant, but his eyes were cold. Mr. Price, Boone said carefully. Ranger Carver, Mrs. Vale. Price's gaze settled on Holt. Mr. Brennan, we haven't been formally introduced. Callum Price, development consultant for Ridge Community Partnership. I know who you are, Holt said. Price smiled. Good, then this conversation will be easier. He gestured to the chairs. May I? It's a free country, Bonnie, Marlowe said. Price sat crossing his legs with casual elegance. I heard about young Gideon. Terrible accident. I'm sure we're all grateful he's going to be okay. It wasn't an accident, Holt said. He was exposed to toxic waste at a site that's supposed to be remediated. According to county records, it is remediated. If there are barrels still present, that's concerning. We'll need to investigate. We, Marlowe's voice was sharp. You don't work for the county. I consult for them, and I represent the interests of people who've invested significant resources in Pinewood Ridge's future. Price's tone remained pleasant, but steel ran beneath it. This town was dying 20 years ago. Unemployment over 30%. Young people leaving, Main Street half empty. The development partnerships changed that. Brought jobs, brought stability. Built on a lie, Boone said. Built on compromise. Price leaned forward slightly. Mr. Brennan, you're former military. You understand operational necessity. Sometimes difficult decisions have to be made for the greater good. I also understand when a mission is built on false intelligence, Holt replied. It gets people killed. The words came out harder than he'd intended. Helmand Province flashed through his mind, the mission briefing he'd questioned, but ultimately accepted the ambush that followed Marcus Chen's blood on sand. Price's expression didn't change. No one has been killed. Thomas Locke, Carter Vale, Ellen Marsh. Should I continue? Tragic accidents, all investigated, all closed. Convenient investigations, Marlowe said. Thorough investigations, Price corrected. Look, I understand you found some old documents. Thomas Locke was a troubled man who made reckless accusations. There was a full county review after his death. Nothing substantiated his claims. Because the evidence was buried, Holt said. Literally. Price sighed as if dealing with stubborn children. Let me be direct. This town employs 247 people through partnerships facilitated by companies I represent. Those jobs exist because development was able to proceed without being blocked by environmental hysteria. If you expose Grid 47N as an active contamination site, those companies will pull out. The jobs disappear. The town dies. People's health, Marlowe began, will be protected through proper remediation, which will fund if there's actually a problem. Price's voice hardened slightly. But if you go public with half-truths and old accusations, you'll destroy this community. Is that what you want? 247 families losing their income for what? To prove a point about something that happened 30 years ago. The question hung in the air like smoke. Holt thought about the men he'd served with, the decisions made in impossible circumstances, the weight of consequences that extended far beyond immediate action. But he also thought about Gideon Nash's chemical-burned hands, about Thomas Locke writing his last words in a journal hidden in a train car, about silence that protected corruption instead of people. The truth isn't negotiable, Holt said quietly. Price studied him for a long moment. I was hoping you'd be reasonable. You strike me as an intelligent man who understands complexity. I understand that a child was poisoned because someone prioritized profit over safety. And I understand that you bought property here with your last savings. Utto Price's smile returned, but it was a predator's expression now. Beautiful land, 30 acres. You've already put work into it. Be ashamed to lose that investment. The threat was clear, even wrapped in polite words. Holt stood. This conversation is over. Price rose smoothly. Think about what I said. You have 48 hours to decide whether you're going to be part of this community's solution or its destruction. Choose wisely, Mr. Brennan. He walked out, leaving behind the faint smell of expensive cologne and veiled menace. He just threatened you, Marlowe said. He did, Holt confirmed. Boone's jaw was tight. He's right about one thing. If this goes public the wrong way, it'll hurt a lot of innocent people. But if it doesn't go public at all, Marlowe countered, the contamination continues. More people could get sick. The truth matters. Truth always matters, Holt said, but so does method. They sat in tense silence until Ray emerged from Gideon's room. The mechanic's eyes were red, but his expression had hardened into something implacable. They're transferring him to Coeur d'Alene for specialized treatment. Chemical exposure protocol. Ray's hands shook. The doctor said if he'd been out there another 2 hours, he might not have made it. Ray, Boone began. I'm done being quiet. Ray's voice was rough but certain. I've lived here my whole life. Worked on every car in this town, including Merrick's, including Price's. I've kept my head down-minded. My business told myself the adults were handling things. He looked at Holt. Your dog saved my son's life. I owe you. What do you need? Information, Holt said. About who knew what and when. I can help with that. Ray pulled out his phone. I've been fixing county vehicles for 20 years, including maintenance trucks that service the restricted areas. I've got records, dates, mileage logs. If someone's been accessing Grid 47N, their vehicles came through my shop. Marlowe's eyes lit up. That's a paper trail. More than paper. I've got digital Wells records going back to 2008. Everything's backed up. Ray's expression was grim. They poisoned my boy. I don't care what it costs. They moved to Boone's cabin to avoid surveillance. Ray brought his laptop and spent 3 hours walking them through maintenance records. The pattern was clear. County vehicles had been accessing Grid 47N regularly. Not remediation crews, inspection vehicles, security patrols. They've been monitoring it, Boone said, making sure no one got close. And if someone did, Marlowe asked. Ray pulled up another file. Look at this, October 1998, week after Thomas Locke died. Brake line replacement on his vehicle. Holt leaned closer. Post-accident, maintenance doesn't make sense unless, Ray's voice trailed off as the implication landed, unless someone wanted to make sure there was no evidence of tampering. You can't prove that, Boone said. Not after 26 years. No, but I can prove consistent patterns. Ray showed them more files. Carter Vale's vehicle, March 2018, brought in for routine maintenance 3 days before his accident. Brake system service. Ellen Marsh never brought her car to me, but county inspection records show her furnace was serviced by a county-contracted HV AC company 2 weeks before she died. The implications were staggering. Not proof of murder, but patterns that suggested methodology. Marlowe was recording everything on her laptop, cross-referencing with her own research. This is enough to demand a federal investigation. EPA, FB, maybe even. Holt's phone buzzed. Unknown number, he answered. Mr. Brennan. The voice was electronically distorted. You're making a mistake. Who is this? Someone who's trying to save you from yourself. Leave tonight. Take your dog. I'll wire 200,000 to any account you specify. Your property will be purchased at a premium. Just walk away. Not interested? Then you're choosing consequences. The line went dead. Holt set the phone down. Ranger, who had been lying near the stove, raised his head. His ears rotated toward the door. Someone's outside, Holt said quietly. Boone moved to the window. A dark pickup truck sat on the road, engine running, windows tinted. As they watched, it drove away slowly. They're escalating, Boone said. Holt's mind was already working through scenarios. Tactical assessment, resources, vulnerabilities. We need to move fast. Get everything to federal authorities before they can suppress it. FBI field office is in Boise, Marlowe said, 5-hour drive. I can make it in 4. Holt looked at Ray. Copy everything to an external drive. Multiple copies. Marlowe, same with your research. Boone, I'll file a formal report with the Forest Service Regional Office. Environmental contamination on federally adjacent land. That triggers mandatory review. They worked through the afternoon with focused intensity. By evening, they had 3 complete evidence packages, hard drive copies, printed documents, photographic evidence, sworn statements. Holt loaded his truck while Ranger supervised from the passenger seat. The plan was simple: leave at dawn, drive to Boise, deliver everything to the FBI field office. Let federal investigation handle what local corruption had buried. But first, he had to go back to his cabin. Collect essentials, secure the property. The drive through Twilight Forest felt different now, threatening. Every shadow held potential danger. But Holt had operated in worse conditions, and fear was just another data point to process and file away. He pulled into his clearing as the last light faded. Everything looked normal. Cabin undisturbed. No fresh tracks, no vehicles. Ranger jumped out and began his standard perimeter check, moving with professional efficiency. Holt unlocked the cabin door and stepped inside. The interior was cold. He'd let the fire die that morning. He moved to rekindle it, going through the familiar motions when Ranger's bark cut through the silence. Not the alert bark from before. This was urgent. Warning. Holt was out the door instantly, hand instinctively reaching for the sidearm he'd retrieved from his locked storage box that morning. Ranger stood at the edge of the clearing, rigid, facing the forest. Every muscle in the dog's body was coiled tight. Then Holt saw what had triggered the response. His truck. The tires had been slashed. All 4, deep cuts that left them deflated and useless. He approached carefully, scanning for other threats. The truck bed had been searched, supplies scattered, though nothing appeared missing. But the message was clear. You're not leaving. Holt pulled out his phone. No service. They'd probably deployed a local jammer, or he was simply too deep in the forest. He was isolated, immobilized, and someone knew it. Ranger moved to his side, pressing against his leg. Not fear, solidarity. Holt's hand dropped to the dog's head. Okay, he said quietly. We're not running anyway. The words felt like a decision crystallizing. He'd come here to hide, to find peace in silence. But peace built on buried truth wasn't peace at all. It was just another form of running. He gathered the scattered supplies, working quickly in the fading light. Then he secured the cabin checking locks and improvising alarm systems with fishing line and tin cans, crude but effective. As full darkness fell, Holt sat near the window, with Ranger at his feet and the evidence packages beside him. His phone buzzed once, brief return of signal. A text message appeared. Final offer. Leave everything. Walk away. Save yourself. Holt typed a single word in response: no. He hit send and turned off the phone. Outside, the forest settled into night sounds. An owl called. Wind moved through pines. Normal, peaceful. But underneath, Holt felt the presence of watchers. Not immediate, not visible, just there. Ranger's breathing was slow and steady. The dog had positioned himself between Holt and the door, not with anxiety, but with purpose. Holt thought about the choice Price had offered. Walk away, take the money, let the town keep its secrets. It would be easier, safer, the rational decision. But he'd made that choice before, in Afghanistan. When he'd seen signs that an intelligence report was flawed, but had deferred to senior officers because questioning authority seemed harder than trusting the system. Marcus Chen had died because he'd chosen easy over right. He wouldn't make that mistake again. A sound outside, soft but distinct. Footsteps on frozen ground. Ranger's head came up, ears forward, alert but not aggressive. Holt moved to the window and looked out. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, backlit by moonlight. too dark to identify. They stood there for perhaps 30 seconds, not approaching, just present. Then they turned and disappeared into the trees. Holt's jaw tightened. Psychological warfare, letting him know he was watched, trying to unnerve him. It wouldn't work. He'd spent months in forward operating bases where actual enemies wanted him dead. A few corporate thugs playing intimidation games were amateur hour by comparison. But it did mean things were accelerating. He settled back near the window and began planning. No truck meant hiking out at dawn. 15 miles to the ranger station through forest. Difficult but manageable. He could carry the evidence. Ranger could lead if trails got confusing. The alternative was waiting for Boone or Marlowe to check on him, but that put them at risk. Number. Better to move independently. He pulled out the topographical map of the area and traced routes by flashlight. The most direct path crossed through federal land skirting the boundary of Grid 47N. Risky given the contamination, but faster than going around. Ranger watched him plan amber eyes reflecting flashlight beam. The dog seemed to understand that movement was coming, that the waiting was almost over. At midnight, Holt heard vehicles, multiple engines approaching on the access road. He killed the flashlight and moved to the window. 3 trucks. They stopped short of the clearing, headlights off, just their silhouettes visible against the lesser darkness of night skying. Doors open. Men got out. At least 6, maybe more. They didn't approach the cabin. They fanned out through the forest, creating a perimeter. Holt felt his pulse steady into the familiar rhythm of operational readiness. This wasn't threat assessment anymore. This was containment. They'd boxed him in. He checked his sidearm. Full magazine, 1 spare. Not much against 6 men, but enough to make anyone think twice about forcing entry. But he suspected they wouldn't try. Not tonight. This was a show of force, letting him know he was surrounded, that leaving wasn't an option. The question was, what came next? The answer arrived 2 hours later as the first hint of dawn gray touched the eastern sky. Radio crackle from one of the surrounding vehicles. Too far to hear clearly, but the rhythm suggested communication, coordination. Then from the direction of the road, the sound of a larger vehicle approaching. An SUV pulled into view. County markings visible, even in pre-dawn light. Deputy Ford Merrick stepped out. He walked to the center of the clearing, stopped and looked directly at the cabin, at the window where Holt stood. Even from this distance, Holt could see his expression. Not anger, not fear, certainty. Merrick pulled something from his coat, a bullhorn. His voice echoed across the clearing, artificially amplified. Holt Brennan, you're under arrest for trespassing on restricted federal land and theft of county property. Come out with your hands visible. You have 2 minutes to comply. Holt's jaw set. It was a fabricated charge. Obvious to anyone who looked at the facts, but in a small town where the deputy had leverage and the nearest federal oversight was hours away, facts were negotiable. And if Holt was in custody, the evidence would disappear. Ray's records would be seized. Marlowe's research would be suppressed. The whole investigation would die in a holding cell. This was the play. Arrest on false charges. Hold him long enough to clean up the evidence. Then release him with warnings. Or not release him at all. Ranger pressed against Holt's leg, a low rumble building in his chest. Steady, Holt murmured. He thought about options. That left one choice. Stand. Make them stand. That left one choice. Stand. Make them come in. Make it public. Make it loud enough that people would ask questions. 1 minute, Merrick's voice called. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Holt moved away from the window and positioned himself near the door. Ranger at his side, both of them ready. Not to fight, to refuse. The seconds counted down in silence, broken only by wind and the idle of engines. Then Merrick's voice again. Time's up. Breach the door. Footsteps approached. Heavy boots on frozen ground. Ranger's entire body tensed. And Holt made a decision that would change everything. He reached down and unclipped the leash from Ranger's harness. Free, he whispered. The dog understood instantly. This wasn't a command to stay. It was permission to choose. The footsteps reached the porch. A voice called out, Holt Brennan, we're coming in. The door shook as something heavy struck it. Ranger looked up at Holt one last time. Amber eyes steady, certain. Then the shepherd turned toward the door and did something he'd never done before in all their years together. He refused to move. Not backward, not to safety. He positioned himself directly in front of Holt, between his handler and whatever was coming through that door. And in that moment, Holt understood. The dog wasn't just refusing to run. He was refusing to let Holt run either. They would face this together. Or not at all. The door splintered as the battering ram struck again, and Holt did something that surprised even himself. He opened it, not to surrender, but to speak. "You want me," Holt said, his voice carrying across the clearing to where Merrick stood. "Come get me, but know this: every second of what happens next will be documented, photographed, recorded, and sent to people who will make sure the world sees it." He held up his phone, recording, live streaming to an encrypted server Marlowe had set up. The men on the porch hesitated. "You have no authority to arrest me," Holt continued. "I haven't trespassed, I haven't stolen, and a federal investigation is already underway. So ask yourself, is following orders worth what comes next?" Silence. Then one of the men stepped back from the door. Then another. Merrick's voice cut through, furious now. "I gave you an order. And I'm thinking about my pension," one of the men called back. The standoff held for 10 seconds that felt like eternity. Then the sound of approaching vehicles shattered it. Multiple engines, coming fast. Everyone turned toward the access road. 4 vehicles roared into the clearing. The first was Boone's Forest Service truck. The second was Marlowe's Subaru. The third was Ray Nash's tow truck. And the fourth was a white SUV with federal government plates. The SUV's doors opened and 2 people stepped out. A man and a woman, both in dark suits, both moving with the controlled authority of federal agents. The woman held up a badge. "Federal Bureau of Investigation, everyone on the ground, hands visible." Now, the men who'd been surrounding Holt's cabin froze. In the growing dawn light, their faces showed the calculation of people suddenly realizing they'd crossed a line they couldn't uncross. "I said down." The female FBI agent's voice carried the kind of authority that came from years of making criminals comply. "Hands behind your heads." Slowly, reluctantly, they dropped to their knees. Even Merrick's Men County employees, who probably thought they were just following orders, understood that federal trumped local. Merrick himself remained standing, his expression cycling through fury, calculation, and finally something that looked like resignation. The male FBI agent approached him. "Deputy Fort Merrick." "Yes." "Special Agent Marcus Webb, FBI. You're under arrest for obstruction of justice, conspiracy to commit environmental crimes, and about a dozen other charges. We'll detail at the field office." He produced handcuffs. "You have the right to remain silent." Holt barely heard the Miranda warning. He was watching the female agent who'd moved toward the cabin with her weapon drawn, but pointed down professional caution, not aggression. "Mr. Brennan," she called. "Here," Holt said, stepping fully into view. Ranger remained at his side, alert but not threatening. "Special Agent Sarah Mitchell." She holstered her weapon as she approached. "Are you injured?" "No." "Your dog?" "He's fine." Mitchell's eyes moved to Ranger, then back to Holt. "Former military Navy SEAL, discharged 2019. That explains the tactical setup." She gestured to the cabin, the sightlines he'd established, the improvised alarm systems. "You knew they were coming. They made it obvious." Mitchell almost smiled. "Miss Vale contacted us last night, said you'd found evidence of a 30-year environmental cover-up and that local authorities were compromised. We were already investigating based on her brother's death in 2018, but your documentation moved everything into high gear." Marlowe appeared at Mitchell's shoulder, her camera still recording. "I sent them everything. The journal, the photos, Ray's maintenance records. When your tires got slashed, I knew they'd move tonight." "How'd you get here so fast?" Holt asked. "We were already in Coeur d'Alene," Webb said, joining them. He'd finished cuffing Merrick. "Been building a case for 6 months. Ms. Vale's information gave us enough for warrants. When she called at midnight saying you were in immediate danger, we mobilized." Boone walked up, looking exhausted but satisfied. "I filed my report with Forest Service Regional Office at 10 p.m. They contacted EPA Emergency Response. There are hazmat teams en route to Grid 47N right now." "What about Lena?" Holt asked suddenly, realizing he hadn't seen the young woman since the night he'd rescued her from the snow. Boone's expression softened. "She's safe. After you brought her here, I moved her to a secure location in Coeur d'Alene. She was terrified the people who left her in that snow knew she had copies of everything. But she gave a full statement to the FBI 2 days ago." Mitchell nodded. "Ms. Frost is entering witness protection. Her testimony about the data manipulation is crucial. She'll be safe." Holt felt something unclench in his chest. The young woman who'd nearly died because she'd chosen truth over comfort would survive, would testify, would matter. Ray Nash's tow truck rolled to a stop near Holt's disabled vehicle. The mechanic jumped out, took one look at the slashed tires, and shook his head. "Sons of bitches. I'll get you new tires, Holt. On the house." "Ray, you don't have to." "Yeah, I do. Your dog saved my boy." Ray's voice was rough with emotion. Gideon's doing better. They got the chemical exposure under control. He's going to be okay. Good, Holt said simply. More vehicles arrived as the sun crested the eastern ridge. EPI and A response teams, additional FBI agents, county sheriff's units from the next county over, untainted by local corruption, even a news van from Boise that had somehow gotten wind of the story. Marlowe smiled grimly at that. I may have tipped off a few journalist friends. This needs to be public. The clearing that had been Holt's refuge for less than a week had transformed into a crime scene. Evidence markers went up. Photographs were taken. Statements recorded. Webb approached Holt again. We need your full account. Everything from when you found the train car to now. Understood. We'll set up at the ranger station. More secure than here. Webb glanced at the cabin, at the damaged door, and the signs of the night's siege. You did good work, Mr. Brennan. A lot of people wouldn't have stood their ground. Holt thought about that, about all the reasons he'd come here. To escape, to hide, to find silence that would drown out memories of failure. Instead, he'd found something else. I had help, Holt said, his hand dropping to Ranger's head. The shepherd's tail moved once. Agreement. The next 6 hours were a blur of statements and documentation. The FBI had set up a mobile command post in the parking lot of the ranger station. Holt, Boone, Marlowe, and Ray each gave detailed accounts while specialists logged everything. Gideon Nash's medical records from the hospital were subpoenaed. The chemical burns on his hands matched compounds found in testing done at Grid 47N that morning by EPA Rapid Response teams. The site wasn't just unsealed, it was actively leaking. Soil samples showed PCB contamination at levels 40 times the safe threshold. Groundwater was compromised, and the barrels, over 200 of them, had been slowly degrading for nearly 30 years, their contents seeping into the earth. This is one of the worst illegal disposal cases I've seen in 20 years, the EPA supervisor told them, and I've seen Superfund sites. By noon, the investigation had expanded to include county officials, members of the development partnerships, and executives from companies that had profited from the covered-up contamination. Callum Price was arrested at his office in town, still maintaining that he'd simply been facilitating economic development. His phone records showed dozens of calls to Merrick in the past 48 hours. Merrick himself sat in federal custody, his carefully constructed mask finally shattered. Under initial questioning, he'd invoked his right to counsel and said nothing. But that lasted exactly 4 hours. Webb emerged from the interrogation room looking satisfied. He's talking. Offered a plea deal for reduced sentence if he testifies against the higher-ups. Will you take it? Marlowe asked. Probably. He's not the apex predator here. There are state officials involved, maybe federal. Webb's expression was grim. This goes deeper than one county. By mid-afternoon, Holt sat in Boone's cabin, the one place that still felt stable, drinking coffee that had gone cold while he stared at nothing in particular. Ranger lay at his feet, finally allowing himself to rest. The shepherd's breathing had settled into the deep rhythm of true sleep, his body recognizing that the mission was complete. Boone sat across from him, looking exhausted. They're saying it'll take months to prosecute, maybe years. Federal environmental cases are complex. But they'll prosecute, Marlowe said. She sat nearby, laptop open, typing furiously. Her article would break nationally within hours. That's what matters. Ray stood by the window watching the street. Town's going to suffer. Price wasn't wrong about that. When those development companies pull out, people will lose jobs. And if the contamination had been exposed 5 years from now, Boone asked quietly. 10 years. How many more people would have gotten sick? How many more kids like Gideon? Ray's shoulders sagged. I know. Doesn't make it easier. Holt understood that tension, the space between immediate consequences and long-term justice. He'd lived in that space for most of his adult life. The town will adapt, he said. Communities are resilient when they have to be. Easy to say when you're not losing your livelihood, Ray replied, but there was no heat in it, just weariness. My brother died for this, Marlowe said softly. Thomas Locke died for it. Ellen Marsh. If their deaths mean anything, it's because the truth came out. Finally. They sat in silence for a while, each processing the weight of what had happened and what was still to come. Then Agent Webb appeared at the door. Mr. Brennan, got a minute? Holt stood, a ranger rising with him automatically. Outside, Webb walked him away from the cabin toward the edge of Boone's property where the forest began. We've been going through Merrick's communications, Webb said. Found something you should know about. He pulled out a tablet and showed Holt an email thread. The sender was listed as Ridge Development Holdings. The messages went back 3 years. Look at this one, Webb said, pointing to a message from 14 months ago. They were tracking property sales in the area, looking for parcels near Grid 47N. When the Hutchins property came up for sale, they tried to buy it through shell companies, but the seller had stipulated it go to an individual buyer, not a corporation. Holt read the email, his chest tightened. They couldn't block the sale, Webb continued, so they monitored who bought it. When your name came up, they ran a background check. Former Navy SEAL, recent separation from service, looking for isolated property. He scrolled to another message. Merrick's assessment was that you'd keep to yourself, that you were trying to disappear, not investigate. They were wrong, Holt said. They were. But here's the thing. Webb pulled up one more message. This is from 2 days after you arrived. Merrick reported that you'd found the train car. The message went to Callum Price, who forwarded it to someone else, someone whose identity we're still tracking. But look at the response. Holt read it, his jaw set. Monitor but do not engage. Subject is former military with trauma history. Will likely avoid confrontation. If he becomes problematic, standard protocols apply. Standard protocols, like the ones that had killed Thomas Locke and Carter Vale. They were ready to kill me, Holt said flatly. Yes, but you didn't follow their script. You didn't isolate, you found allies. You gathered evidence and moved faster than they anticipated. Webb closed the tablet. You also had a significant tactical advantage they didn't account for. He nodded toward Ranger, who sat alertly nearby. A dog that wouldn't let you run, Webb said. Merrick's notes mentioned that. He wrote, subject shows strong attachment to working dog, possible leverage point. But they misunderstood. It wasn't leverage. It was the reason you stayed. Holt looked at Ranger. The shepherd's amber eyes met his with perfect clarity. He knew, Holt said quietly, before I did. That running wasn't the answer. Webb studied him for a moment. You're a hard man to read, Mr. Brennan, but I'll tell you what I see. I see someone who came here looking for peace and found a war instead. And instead of walking away, you fought it. That takes a particular kind of courage. Or stubbornness. Sometimes they're the same thing. Webb extended his hand. We'll need you available for testimony when this goes to trial. But for now, you're free to go. Whatever that means in your situation. Holt shook his hand. What happens to the town? EPA will handle remediation. It'll take years and millions of dollars. The county will have to pay most of it, which means budget cuts and tax increases. Some businesses will fail. Some people will leave. Webb's expression was somber. But the alternative was letting the contamination spread. Another generation of kids like Gideon getting sick. Sometimes there are no good options, just less bad ones. Holt understood that arithmetic. He'd made those calculations in combat zones where every choice had cost measured in human suffering. Webb headed back toward the command post, leaving Holt alone with Ranger at the forest's edge. The sun had passed its zenith and was beginning its descent toward the western ridgeline. In a few hours, it would be dark again. Another night in a landscape that had changed completely in less than a week. Holt had no cabin. It would need extensive repairs after the breach. No truck yet. Ray was working on the tires. No possessions beyond what he carried. He was in effect exactly where he'd started. Untethered. Unmoored. Except he wasn't. Because Ranger sat beside him warm and solid and present. And because somewhere in the past few days, Holt had stopped running from something and started moving towards something else. As he stood there, movement at the forest's edge caught his eye. He tensed instinctively, but it was just a deer doe watching him with dark eyes before bounding away into the trees. Ranger tracked it with interest, but didn't chase. The dog understood priorities. Holt's phone buzzed, a text from Boone. Media wants interview, your call. Holt typed back, Marlowe handles media, I'm not the story. But he was wrong about that. By evening, his name was attached to the breaking news. Former Navy SEAL exposes decades-long environmental cover-up. The story had everything journalists loved, conspiracy, corruption, a lone hero standing against overwhelming odds. Holt ignored most of it. Let Marlowe manage the narrative. She was better at it anyway, and she had personal stakes that gave her credibility. What mattered was that the truth was out, that Gideon Nash would recover, that Lena Frost would testify safely, that the contamination would finally be addressed. The rest was noise. 3 months later, spring came to northern Idaho. The snow melted from the clearing where Holt's cabin had stood. Green shoots pushed through scorched earth, not scorched from fire, but renewed through effort. Nature reclaiming the space with the patient inevitability of living things. Holt stood at the edge of that clearing, looking at what he'd built. Not a replica of the old cabin. Something new. The foundation was laid stronger this time, reinforced concrete instead of simple pier blocks. The frame was rising. By summer's end, there would be walls and a roof and windows that faced south to catch maximum light. Ranger lay in a patch of sunlight, nearby, chin resting on his paws, watching Holt work with the contented calm of a dog who knew his purpose had been fulfilled and his place was secure. The scar on the shepherd's shoulder was barely visible now, a thin line of fur that grew in slightly darker than the rest. The bullet graze from that night when they'd fled the burning cabin had healed completely. The vet had said he'd been lucky. Another inch and it would have shattered bone. But Ranger had kept moving even injured, refusing to quit, and that had made all the difference. The trial had been scheduled for fall. Merrick had taken his plea deal, agreeing to testify against higher-level conspirators in exchange for a reduced sentence. Price was fighting the charges, but his legal team was running out of delays, and 3 state officials had already resigned under the weight of the investigation. The EPA had fenced off Grid 47N and begun preliminary remediation. Early estimates suggested the cleanup would cost $70 million and take a decade. Pinewood Ridge was struggling. 3 businesses had closed. Unemployment had ticked up 4%. The town council had voted to raise property taxes to cover legal fees and environmental fines. But Gideon Nash had recovered fully. The specialized treatment in Coeur d'Alene had prevented long-term damage from the chemical exposure. He was back in school, back to being a 9-year-old boy whose biggest concern was whether he'd make the Little League team. Ray had started a victims advocacy group for families affected by the contamination. 17 people had come forward with health issues potentially linked to groundwater exposure. Their lawsuits would take years to resolve, but at least they had standing to fight now. Marlowe's article had won a regional journalism award and been picked up by national outlets. She'd been offered positions at major newspapers, but had turned them down, choosing instead to stay in Pinewood Ridge and continue documenting the story as it unfolded. Someone has to be the town's memory, she'd told Holt. Might as well be me. Boone had been promoted to regional supervisor for the Forest Service. His first act had been to declassify all historical records related to Grid 47N and make them publicly available. Sunlight's the best disinfectant, he'd said, and Holt had stayed. Not because he had to. The FBI had cleared him of any obligation to remain in Idaho. He could have gone anywhere. But Ranger had taught him something in that moment when the dog had refused to run, refused to let Holt run either. Peace wasn't something you found by escaping. It was something you built by standing your ground. So he'd used the insurance payout from the cabin minimal, but enough, and started rebuilding. Not the same structure, something new, something intentional. A vehicle pulled up the access road. Holt turned to see Marlowe's Subaru followed by Boone's truck. They'd started doing this, stopping by on weekends, helping with construction, bringing food and conversation, and the slow accumulation of connection that turned strangers into something else. Community, maybe. Or just people who'd been through fire together and decided to build something from the ashes. Marlowe got out carrying a cooler. Brought lunch, hope you like sandwiches because that's literally all I know how to make. Sandwiches are good, Holt said. Boone emerged with a toolbox. Thought you might need an extra pair of hands on those roof trusses. Could use it. They worked through the afternoon. The physical labor was grounding, purposeful. Each board placed, each nail driven, a small act of construction that added up to something larger. When the sun began its descent, they sat on what would eventually be the porch, eating sandwiches and drinking beer and watching light paint the forest in shades of gold. Heard from Ray, Marlowe said. He's talking about running for town council. Wants to make sure there's oversight on any future development deals. Good, Boone said. Town needs people who will ask hard questions. Speaking of which, Marlowe turned to Holt, I've been researching other towns with similar situations. Small communities, economic pressure, environmental corners cut. There are patterns. I'm thinking about doing a series. You should, Holt said. Would you be willing to talk on record about what happened here? Holt considered it. 6 months ago, he would have refused, would have said he wanted no part of public attention or the weight of being someone's example. But he'd learned something about silence, about what it protected and what it enabled. Yeah, he said, I'll talk. Marlowe smiled. Thank you. As evening deepened, Boone and Marlowe headed home. Their taillights disappeared down the access road, leaving Holt and Ranger alone in the gathering dark. Holt walked to the spot where the train car still sat deep in his forest. The FBI had photographed it, documented it, then left it where it stood. Moving it would cost more than it was worth, and it had become something of a memorial. Someone, probably Marlowe, had placed a small plaque on the site of Thomas Locke, 1957 to 1998. He told the truth. May we have the courage to listen. Holt stood there for a long moment, thinking about the man who'd hidden evidence in a rusted freight car, hoping someone would find it. Someone who'd care enough to act. That someone had turned out to be Holt. But it could have been anyone. Any person who'd bought this land, explored this forest, found this impossible vehicle sitting where it shouldn't be. As he turned to leave, something caught his eye, a glint of metal among the leaves that had accumulated at the train car's base. Holt knelt and brushed them aside. A small metal box, not the one he'd found before. This one was smaller, oxidized by weather, but still intact. He opened it carefully. Inside a photograph. Thomas Locke, younger, smiling, standing beside a woman and two children. His family, probably. And beneath it, a note on weathered paper. "Thank you for listening. TLL." Holt's breath caught. The handwriting matched the journal. But this note was fresh. The paper wasn't decades old. Impossible. Unless someone had left it recently. Someone who knew what Holt had done. He looked at the photograph again. On the back, written in different handwriting, "Found this in Dad's things after he died. Thought you might want it. He'd be proud of you. Margaret Locke." Thomas's sister. Still alive. Still watching. Not a ghost after all, but a reminder that the dead spoke through those who remembered them. Holt tucked the photograph carefully into his jacket pocket and stood. A sound behind him. Ranger had followed, moving through the twilight forest with the quiet confidence of a dog who knew every tree and rock on this land. "You were right," Holt said to him, "about staying." Ranger's tail moved once. Acknowledgement. They walked back to the clearing together. The foundation of the new cabin was solid beneath their feet. Above them, stars were beginning to emerge in a sky that had cleared after the afternoon's brief shower. Holt thought about the letter he'd received last week from the Navy SEAL K-9 training program. They'd heard about what happened in Pinewood Ridge. Marlowe's article had spread wider than any of them expected, and they wanted to know if Holt would be interested in consulting, helping train the next generation of handlers and working dogs. He hadn't answered yet, was still sitting with the question, but he was leaning toward yes, because Ranger had taught him that purpose wasn't found in isolation. It was found in service, in standing beside others when the easy choice was to stand alone, in refusing to run even when, especially when running felt safer. The night settled around them, cool and clear. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called. Wind moved through new leaves on trees that had survived winter. Holt sat on the foundation of his half-built cabin and looked out at the forest that had saved him by refusing to let him hide. Ranger settled beside him, warm presence in the dark. And for the first time in longer than Holt could remember, the silence wasn't something to escape. It was something to protect. Not empty silence. Not the silence of things buried and forgotten, but the silence of things built and growing, of truth told and received, of ground held and foundations laid. The silence of home. Sometimes miracles didn't come as lightning. Sometimes they came as a true who refused to move when his handler wanted to run, as a train car sitting where it shouldn't be, holding secrets that wouldn't stay buried, and as a town forced to reckon with its past instead of burying it deeper. As a man who came looking for peace and found something better, purpose. The sky deepened to full dark. Stars multiplied overhead, the Milky Way visible, in a way it never was in cities, a river of light crossing the heavens. Holt thought about Thomas Locke writing his last words in a journal hidden in metal and rust. Thought about Carter Vale and Ellen Marsh and all the others who tried to tell the truth and paid for it. Their deaths hadn't been meaningless, because someone had listened, and that listening had changed everything. "Thank you," Holt said quietly, to the forest, to the dog, to the ghost of a man he'd never met but whose courage had given him a choice he didn't know he needed to make. Ranger's breathing was slow and even. Content. The foundation beneath them was solid, and somewhere in the distance, spring and runoff fed streams that would in time run clean again. Not perfect, not untouched by what had been done, but healing, like the man who sat watching stars rise, like the doe who'd brought him home, like the truth that had finally, after 30 years, found light. The night held them both in silence that was no longer empty, and in that silence, peace settled, not the peace of escape, the peace of standing your ground and building something that would last. Holt stood, muscles pleasantly sore from honest work. "Come on," he told Ranger. "Tomorrow we've got more to build." The shepherd rose and followed. Together they walked toward the tent Holt had erected while the cabin grew around it properly, set this time, no sagging corners to earn canine judgment. Tomorrow there would be more work, more testimony to prepare, more decisions about what came next. But tonight there was this. Solid ground, clear sky, a dog who'd refused to let him run, and the quiet certainty that he was finally exactly where he needed to be. not hiding from his past, building toward his future. One board at a time, one choice at a time, one moment of courage at a time, the forest held them both as night deepened, and in the morning they would begin again, together, as they were always meant to be, not running, standing, home.